introduce Maggie. First, I also want to call attention to Eric McGhee, who is another author of this report, who is going to come up and help with the Q&A. Eric's a research fellow at PPIC. Dan Krim, who also did work on this report, is here as well. He's a research associate at PPIC. And Patrick Murphy is our new director of research at PPIC, and he's out from San Francisco to be here too. So I will introduce Maggie, and she'll come up and give our presentation today. Maggie is a former public school teacher in Baltimore. She got a master's in public policy at the University of Michigan. She's currently a PhD student at UC Davis in education, and she's done a number of reports at PPIC over recent years, primarily in school finance, and many of the reports were very formative in the local control funding formula that we adopted recently. So with that, please welcome Maggie Weston.
Thanks, Dave, for the introduction. Before we get started on kind of the main findings of the report, I want to make sure everyone's on the same page about what parcel taxes actually are. So for most of their history, school districts in California largely finance their own operations through the local ad valorem property tax, so property taxes based on the value of land. But in 1978, Californians improved Proposition 13, which created a uniform statewide property tax of 1% of assessed value and limited increases in that assessed value over time. It also prohibited local governments, including school districts, from increasing the property tax rate. And so unlike some of the school districts in the rest of the state, schools in California have very little authority over the level of funding that they have. It's a very state-centered system. Despite the fact that Prop 13 was a tax limiting measure, it actually, kind of its interpretation by the courts and subsequent legislation, actually created a new form of taxation in California, the parcel tax. So Prop 13 required that all special taxes be approved by 2/3 of local voters. And in 1982, the state Supreme Court defined special taxes as those earmarked for special purposes. And school districts, primarily spending these revenues on education, were able to then levy a special tax. And so the first school district parcel tax passed in 1983. So it's a very unique aspect of California's kind of fiscal situation. For the most part, unlike ad valorem property taxes, parcel taxes are not based on the value of the land. So it's based on the land itself. So each parcel in a district pays the same fee regardless of the value of that land, the size, or its use, with very few exceptions. It requires, like I said, 2/3 voter approval, and it has been subject over time since its creation to just this year to many legal challenges. So it's kind of a contentious issue. So why are we talking about parcel taxes today? First and foremost, there's been interest for several years in changing the threshold, lowering it from that 2/3 voter approval to 55%. As a constitutional amendment, that would need to go before voters, and it needs 2/3 of the legislature to put that on the ballot. Some have speculated that now the Democrats control 2/3 of the legislature, this might appear before voters, relatively soon. As I mentioned, there have been some legal challenges just this year. A parcel tax in Alameda was overturned because it charged residents a different rate than commercial property, and that was overturned by the courts. So there's kind of a lot of interesting news happening, and that's likely to affect other school districts in the state that have tried to do or have parcel tax that do the same thing. And then finally, the context for school finance has changed quite a bit in the last few months. So in July, Governor Brown approved the local control signed the local control funding formula, which will direct a really increasing share of state revenue to districts serving lots of disadvantaged students. And so while the parcel tax, as we'll find, tends to benefit a lot of wealthy kind of areas of the state, And that might mean something different in this new context. So we can talk about that more. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll be focusing on kind of the characteristics of parcel taxes in school districts relative to those raised by other local governments, talk about the potential effect of a change in the threshold, and offer some conclusions. So school district parcel taxes in 2010-11 totaled $317 million statewide. That's less than 1% of total K-12 revenue. School districts propose about half of all parcel tax measures, the other half being proposed by other local governments, cities, counties, and special districts like library districts. About 60% of all measures proposed by school districts have been passed at that 2/3 threshold, and they tend to be in more affluent areas of the state. Unlike parcel taxes from other local governments, school district parcel taxes, the vast majority of them have a time limit. So they expire typically in 4 to 10 years, subject to renewal, that sort of thing. This is not the case with other types of parcel taxes. They're typically this flat fee like we've talked about, and a majority of them have an exemption for senior citizens. And the legislature has explicitly permitted school districts to exempt seniors and disabled residents from parcel taxes, and this is not an exemption granted to other types of local governments and special districts. And then finally, the revenue, although it totaled $317 million statewide, it averages about $584 per pupil, representing somewhere from 5 to 10% of a school district's budget. And it ranges, again, from $25 per pupil to more than $4,500 per pupil. So in certain places it has a big effect, but kind of the overall effect statewide is relatively modest. So let's turn to some of the key features of districts that have passed parcel taxes. Generally, they tend to be more advantaged or serve fewer disadvantaged students. So what I've done is I've characterized districts into 4 groups. On the far left are districts that have passed a parcel tax and got that 2/3 vote. The next are districts that have had at least one measure clear 55%, but has not passed. The next group are those that they've offered, it's totally failed, it wouldn't have passed even with a lower threshold. And finally, and this represents most districts in the state, they've never even proposed a parcel tax. And so what you can see, on average in California, about 57% of students are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, and they're districts that have passed a parcel tax or cleared that 55% threshold enroll fewer of these students than the statewide average. And the same for English learners. The statewide average is about 23%, 25%, and they have fewer than the statewide average. Not only do parcel tax districts benefit from that extra revenue from the parcel tax itself, they also tend to have other types of local revenue. So in that category, the kind of grayish color are revenues such as student fees, developer fees, the proceeds from the sale or use of unused buildings. And you can see that that revenue averages more than $650 per pupil in districts that have passed parcel taxes, compared to about $200 per pupil in districts that have never even proposed a parcel tax. In addition, about 1/3 of districts with parcel taxes are what we call basic aid, or they have excess local property taxes. As Dave mentioned, my other report released yesterday on basic aid districts, so I'd encourage you to take a look at that if you have more questions, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. But generally, the point here is that not only do they have kind of parcel tax revenue, which in itself may be seen as a big bonus, they have these other forms of local revenue as well. Finally, districts that have passed parcel taxes are heavily concentrated in the 9-county San Francisco Bay area. About 80% of all districts with parcel taxes are in the Bay Area, and 55% of all districts in the Bay Area have parcel taxes. And we might posit several reasons for this concentration in the Bay Area, including that kind of more affluent residents with more disposable income to spend on education, or the more liberal attitudes towards taxation and government services generally. We can talk about others in the Q&A. So let's turn now to what might happen if voters approved and even went to the ballot with a lower threshold. So if the threshold were already 55%, you would see a big increase in that passage rate. So as I said, about 60% of districts currently have been successful, of the parcel tax measures have been passed, 60%. That would increase something more like 90% if the threshold had been 55%. However, as I showed in those prior two graphs, the districts that have cleared that 55% threshold very closely resemble districts that already have parcel taxes along those socioeconomic and demographic characteristics, and also in terms of their geography. So the ones that have cleared 55% also tend to be in that Bay Area. So would lowering a threshold, we would expect maybe an increase in that passage rate, but would it induce more districts or different types of districts to put a parcel tax measure before voters? To get a sense of that, we took a look at a similar change in school construction bonds. So in 2000, voters approved Proposition 39, which lowered the threshold for passing school construction bonds from 2/3 to 55%. The comparison isn't perfect. School construction bonds, are quite different from parcel taxes. They finance long-term infrastructure projects, whereas parcel taxes tend to be used for day-to-day operations. But it is kind of the similar change. They both are for schools, so this is kind of the best case that we can examine. And what we find is that after the passage of Proposition 39, the passage rate of school construction bonds increased quite dramatically, about 19 percentage points from about 58% to 77%. And it's important to note that that jump was not some sort of change in California saying, we want more taxes, we want more bonds, because actually the passage or rates for other types of bonds and for parcel taxes themselves declined in that same time period. You can see too that the share of measures that cleared 55%, which is that orange bar, increased quite a bit after Proposition 39. And at the same time, measures that would have passed anyway, so those ones that garnered the supermajority, the brown bars, actually declined quite a bit. Also important to note that the number of bonds didn't actually change that much in the period. So it's hard to say whether people are like, hey, we have this 55%, let's go out and try and get a whole bunch of more bonds approved. Again, school construction bonds are a little unique in that sense. There have been quite a few. There have been state money kind of in the pre-period. So it's just kind of hard to say that it had a huge effect like we might expect in terms of diversifying the group of districts passing parcel taxes. So again, kind of the effector is a little unclear what might happen if we lowered the threshold. It's likely you would, expect kind of on the natural that perhaps more districts would attempt a parcel tax measure, but the districts that have already cleared that 55% look a lot like districts that currently have parcel taxes. So it's hard to say that the types of districts that will be successful will look very different than those who are currently successful with that lower threshold. At the same time, as I talked about in the beginning with the local control funding formula, there are kind of two issues to keep in mind. So first, in the discussions of the local control funding formula over the past 2 years, there was a lot of talk about winners and losers. So the state is investing pretty heavily in districts with high proportions of low-income students and English learners. And so the districts that don't have a lot of these students really are only getting back to their pre-recession funding levels. And so it may be the case that lowering the threshold and allowing those loser districts who currently have parcel taxes to pass more, or the other districts that are kind of similar to them to pass more parcel taxes with that lower threshold, might make the formula a little bit more palatable to them. At the second main point about the local control funding formula is that it's right now, or kind of the philosophy of the formula, is that you're giving local school districts more autonomy over how they spend their money, right? So they're making a lot more decisions about where to allocate dollars. Perhaps also lowering a threshold, giving them more authority or possibility to increase their revenues or change their funding levels, might kind of fall under that similar philosophy of local control. And then finally, we've been focusing on the constitutional amendment and kind of that threshold change, but there are also other there's other interest in changing parcel taxes. So like I said, with the Alameda court case, there's been some interest in perhaps explicitly allowing school districts to charge different types of property, different rates. And so it's just something to kind of keep in mind over the next year as we move forward. So with that, I'd like to invite Eric up, and we can answer any of your questions. And remember, there's a microphone, so raise your hand and someone will come to you.
Thank you. This actually is good information. Couple things come to mind. One is 55% is a pretty stupid vote threshold for passing ballot measures. As you probably know, it took us 2 unsuccessful tries at a simple majority to pass school bonds, and we kind of fell back to 55. And secondly, it strikes me that parcel taxes are a pretty stupid tax. They're regressive. They're not economically sensitive. The tax base doesn't grow as the economy grows. You don't get more parcels, right, as the economy grows. Anything in your research that might speak to, number one, a simple majority? What would be the impact of a simple majority in terms of passage of local school taxes? And secondly, any thoughts about, because parcel taxes are simply one flavor of special tax. There's nothing that one could pass a statute, a majority vote statute, to authorize school districts to levy any kind of tax as a special tax, with the exception of, as you say, ad valorem property taxes. So any sense as to what might be the outlook for other flavors of taxes to be imposed, either as general or special taxes?
Yeah, sure. So we didn't specifically split out the 50% and lower versus 50 to 55. We just kind of took 55 and below as a lump category. But I think there were some of those districts that you saw that were sort of poorer, served poorer students, more free and reduced price lunch, that kind of thing. There were at least some of those in that 50 to 55% range. So if you were to lower it down to 50%, you might pick up more of those kinds of districts for sure.
In terms of kind of the regressivity issue, so one of my co-authors from our school of finance work, a professor at UC Santa Barbara, an econ professor, John Sonsley, he has a paper coming out that looks explicitly at kind of the tax price issue. And basically, you know, nothing in statute right now explicitly prohibits a rate per square foot, for say. It just has to apply uniformly to all taxpayers, so to all parcels. So that was kind of the issue in that Alameda case about business has to do something and residents get this other thing. And so he posits at the end of that paper that actually the parcel tax could be a little bit more progressive and look a little bit more like the ad valorem property tax if you think that size is at all related to value. In terms of the other flavors of taxation, so back during the Getting Down to Facts studies and stuff, there was a lot of work kind of on that, looking at what other states allow. For example, San Francisco Unified does benefit from a sales tax, and they're allowed to do that because it's a city and a county and a school district. And so they're the only one in the state that has kind of this other kind of flavor. And so I think it's definitely worth thinking about, and if the legislature puts on some proposals or wants some help looking at that, we'd be happy to dig deeper. Yeah, Amy?
So can you just give us a sense of what the Alameda case was and where it is right now, what the status is?
Sure, so it was about the Alameda case. So it was Alameda, school district passed this parcel tax that charged, I think, $120 per parcel for residents, and had kind of, for business, commercial property, it was a rate not to exceed X thousand dollars per parcel. A local taxpayer challenged that, saying that violates the state constitution of uniformity. So right now, parcel tax says you can pass this thing as long as it applies uniformly to all taxpayers for school districts, with the exception of you can exempt senior citizens and disabled people. It was challenged. The appeals court invalidated the state appeals court invalidated the measure. Most of the money raised was actually on the commercial property, so that's a little tricky. And then the state Supreme Court refused to take up the appeal. So basically, that's the law of the land. There are a lot of other a handful of other school districts that have a very similar type of commercial versus residential. As far as I understand, a taxpayer in that school district would need to challenge that in order to invalidate it. So going forward, you can't do that, but I don't know that it necessarily invalidates the other districts that have this type of parcel tax.
Which is not super common, I would say. It's
No, a handful.
yeah,
in the
it's-
Bay Area.
Yeah,
same.
right.
Yes, Amy up front. Same row. Yeah.
I just had a question out of curiosity. If you looked at the owner occupancy rates of some of the communities that didn't pass, as opposed to those that did pass, as another element of
I
what might
did,
constitute-
and it was not statistically significant, which is why I didn't make the report. Same thing for basic aid. Kind of shocking. A little counterintuitive. Yes, Ray.
That actually just triggered another question in my mind. I guess an apartment building, being one parcel, would pay the same dollar amount as a single-family dwelling. Was that the same question she's getting at, as to if a community is primarily like apartments, are they more likely to pass it as opposed to one that's primarily single-family housing, or don't you know that?
We did not look at that question, but it is true, right? Then that was kind of one of the big arguments about the regressivity of the parcel tax, that this giant complex pays the same as, the single family home a few doors down. We didn't look at that variable. I would have to look at it. But I think that some school districts, when we looked at it, had tried to a handful of school districts have been experimenting and kind of testing the boundaries of the parcel tax, and they have tried some things about apartment buildings versus paying a higher rate than single-family homes.
Yeah, it's one of those things that prior to this Alameda case, at least, they had made exemptions for. Sometimes it would be, okay, this is only applying to single-family homes, this is only applying to, or there's a different rate for businesses versus residential, those kinds of exceptions. And I think all those are thrown into doubt now after the case. So.
The tax per person, apartment complex can obviously be a lot lower than the tax per person in household. And even if the apartment owner pays the tax, passing it on to the residents, they're not going to count very much. So the house would be more likely to pass it.
I mean, we did look at whether these senior exemptions make any difference, and it didn't seem to matter. So.
Amy, over here, Kelly.
I'm just wondering what your basic data sources are. Is it state controllers' reports or something else?
Well, we have sort of two different data sources. One is a bunch of demographics about the school districts as they are currently constituted. And then the other is the California Elections Data Archive, which is put together by Sac State, and has all of the every local election back to 1995. And then we were actually able to get a hold of some election data for earlier years as well, back into the 1980s. But most of our election data is since 1995, and then our demographic data is primarily just more recent.
Where'd the revenue data come from?
Yeah, so that comes from, so school districts report their revenues and expenditures through the Standard Account Code Structure, SACS. It's a big data set. And so it's reported parcel tax revenue, which actually is kind of interesting because we had a few cases where a district, we have a record of an election and they have no parcel tax revenue and it's like off by millions. And we have kind of the opposite case where they have some revenue and not sure when that election happened. So it's a little, little interesting.
When you talk about how many school districts have parcel taxes, it's
a fuzzy number.
Yeah, it's sort of a Heisenberg uncertainty principle there, but.
Yeah.
And one more question. Did you run into any hybrids where you might have a bond issue where the bonds are paid from the proceeds of a parcel tax?
So it's interesting. So we looked at only general fund parcel taxes, which are for kind of these operating expenses. But yes, there are Sacramento City Unified, for example, had a bond and it's being paid off by a very small parcel tax. So that is one way to finance a bond. In the back.
Did you go into the study assuming that parcel taxes were good for students, assuming that the money would result in higher grad rates, completion, persistence, dropout rate, those kind of things? Or did you compare that against districts of similar demographics that didn't have parcel taxes and additional funds?
I mean, I don't think the purpose of this particular report was not to evaluate whether parcel taxes work in some sense, but what might happen if you change the threshold. So.
And certainly so one of the other kind of findings that I guess I didn't really talk about is that most districts that have passed a parcel tax pass it again, right? So a lot of the measures are just kind of reauthorizing after the time limit, having another parcel tax. So clearly it's very popular with certain school districts. For example, in one school district, it's like 30% of their budget. So it's clearly very important to their operations.
Which is not, I mean, that's one of the ways in which parcel taxes are different than construction bonds. The construction bonds don't have that sort of legacy sense. Like they're just sort of all over the place. Different districts have proposed them at different times. It tends to be driven a lot more by the state matching funds, that kind of thing. So, but parcel taxes are just kind of, it's like this community of districts. It's like raw parcel taxes, and they just keep passing them over and over again.
Yeah.
For the districts with students of color, lower wage, I know your presentation here doesn't really discuss, but you would assume or you would imagine that those districts that are struggling for funding would try and take advantage of some other means of funding their operations. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. So I think we found that the rate had declined over this period because during the Great Recession, a lot of districts were trying to pass parcel taxes, and it were a lot of those districts that were in kind of that category of didn't clear 55%, and so a lot of school districts have been struggling. We had huge sustained cuts over a period of years, and so I think that did induce people to try parcel taxes that maybe hadn't before. And so maybe now that they have kind of an experience with a parcel tax and voters have seen it before, maybe that might affect future decisions.
And you keep in mind that the money that is the parcel tax is producing is coming from that same community of disadvantaged people in many cases. So our argument is the reason you see it in these wealthier districts is they've got extra money to throw around. So they're like, why not spend it on our schools? But some of the places that need the money the most would not have it to offer.
So the state local control funding formula is designed to kind of address that long-standing inequity in the state. So.
And that's why maybe this is maybe some kind of parcel tax reform could dovetail nicely with this local control funding formula. So.
Yeah, Ray again.
Ultimately, the tax rate per parcel and the passage rate?
Um,
Tax rate per parcel and passage
That,
rate
that was,
relationship?
we wanted to look at that. The problem is that the data source we had was this California Elections Data Archive, and it wasn't always the case that they would tell you what the parcel, in the ballot description, right? Maybe it was deeper in that particular, ballot pamphlet. We just didn't have the resources to go hunting down all these old ballot pamphlets. So we wanted to do that. We sort of started keeping track of it as we were working our way through these different measures, but
I think there's a
It
lot
was-
of debate about that at the local level before they put the tax on the ballot, how much do you think we can get from the voters? And
Yeah, I
pretty
mean,
sure Davis has multiple taxes simultaneously.
Well, and there's a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence from, districts who have put on parcel taxes that the elections firms or the people who are helping them manage it kind of survey the residents, get a good sense. It seems like that $120, $100 per parcel is really popular. And that's kind of what they can stomach, and therefore that's what ends up making the ballot. One kind of interesting thing that, again, I didn't really highlight in the presentation is the idea of the tax price. So this is basically number of students per parcel, right, or per household. And so if you have a much lower tax price, you have a much higher passage rate. Right, so you can spread that money kind of
Yeah,
on
same
fewer
model that goes to-
students. In the back. Yeah, next week.
Did you look at any of in comparing the parcel tax piece to the school bonds with the change to 55%, did you look at any changing geographic distribution? Because I noticed, in the parcel tax piece, it was all Bay Area, but I didn't hear that in the 55% piece on the bonds. And just as an example, LA Unified, finally woke up and passed some bonds, and after the 55% threshold became. So are we moving down south a little bit on that piece, or geographic distribution?
So if you look in the report on page 11, which is figure 1, it shows those two maps side by side.
it shows
So-
the companion map to the one that she showed here.
Which is that-
For bonds.
They are far more widespread. One thing that we were thinking about and looked into today was kind of school district parcel taxes versus other types of parcel taxes for fire and police. And so do you want to talk about that
Yeah,
geographic
so-
scope?
What's interesting about that is that they actually these other kinds of parcel taxes are broader in their geographic scope. They're still sort of disproportionately in the Bay Area, but not nearly to the same extent that the school district measures are. However, the passage rate for both non-school and school parcel taxes is virtually identical in the Bay Area and everywhere else. It's about 2/3 of the measures that come up in the Bay Area, whether they're school parcel taxes or not, pass, and about 35 to 40% in the rest of the state pass. So it's something to do with the jurisdictions and whether they decide to put something on the ballot, but the difference between the types of voters is the same regardless. They view these parcel taxes apparently as very similar.
Sure, Rick, you have the.
Your passage rate statistics include both the original measure as well as when they want to re-up a tax that's been approved in the past?
Yes.
'Cause my hunch that would make your statistics kind of overstate the passage rates, because it's much more, I think, more
So-
likely that they would pass after you've had it before.
Right, in different parts of the reports, we're dealing with different data sets. Like I said, we have these two different data sets. One is the district says we have them now, and then the other is a data set of ballot measures going back to 1995. And so when we were looking at at passage rates, we tended to look at just those districts, like when we were wondering, so which districts have offered a parcel tax and passed it, which ones have offered it and
Ever.
got 55%, those kinds of statistics were all calculated for the entire history of that district as we have it in our data set. So we were able to sort of account for some of those issues.
I suspect the reason most of them are time limited is because of the GAN limit. They have to, they can only get 4-year authorization to spend above their appropriations limits. They have to go back to the voters for that. I suspect that's why most of these get
Yeah.
re-upped. The other thing I was curious about, and you were looking at the, I guess the ballot materials maybe, any difference in passage rates where they were telling the voters the proceeds of this tax is going to be used sort of for general purposes of the district versus some specific thing like the library programs or after school or whatever.
Teacher salaries.
Any sense of that?
Right, and we didn't look specifically at that, but they do vary some, and most of them do describe some specific purpose for the tax, but we didn't look at to see how it varied depending on how it was described. Some of them will do both. They'll say, we want money for the school district, and it's also going to go to this specific thing, you know. So, but that could be something that could be a follow-on study for sure.
And in particular for that, kind of the ones that we didn't have a record of an election, it was a lot of the GAN limit, sort of districts that have had these for a long time, since their inception. Sure.
And again, one other point about that is if you're to look at that kind of thing, it starts to become a little tricky to say, you know, how does this variation in the wording affect voters? Because you don't know what else might be going on in terms of differences between those districts, the ones that do it a certain way versus another way. What you really want is to do some sort of survey of the public and, you know, give half the sample one question wording and half the other, that kind of thing. It gets tricky to do it with the actual election returns because these districts are deciding what they want to put on the ballot in the first place.
Did you examine if there were any correlations between the size of the school district, either the number of students they served or the geographical area that they were, and whether or not they had actually proposed one and not passed or had a successful parcel tax pass?
We did. We looked at enrollment, and districts that have successfully passed or cleared are slightly smaller. I don't think it was highly statistically significant. And then, you know, LAUSD is in the ones that has never even cleared, as is San Diego. I mean, that's like a huge group of students, right? So they look much larger. I do have a variable for kind of square miles and student density, and so I could go back and look at that for you if you're interested, but I don't know off the top of my head. Sure.
You said you looked at you looked at non-school local government parcel taxes as well as school local government parcel taxes. And I wondered if you found first whether there was much overlap between geographic areas that were covered by both a non-school government and a school district that adopted parcel taxes, or related to that, whether there were jurisdictions that were covered by a school parcel tax where a local government came in, or vice versa, and may have been unsuccessful. In other words, did you test whether there was any interaction between layers of government asking for and either receiving or having parcel taxes rejected?
That's a good question, but no. Yeah.
On this side?
You mentioned at the beginning of your remarks that the legislature is looking at reforms. Other than dropping the voter threshold to 55%, what additional reforms do you think are on the back burner that could percolate forward?
Well, there's a fix for the Alameda case, right?
Right, so Bonta has expressed interest in explicitly allowing differences by commercial and residential.
Yeah.
So they're looking at splitting the role? Yeah.
Ask Rick. Yeah, up front or over there.
Hi. I was just curious, is there any oversight of the funds collected by the parcel taxes? And then how are those funds transparent to the public?
Good question. So School districts have to report their revenues and expenditures. That is publicly available. The data set is called SACS. You can download it from the Department of Education's website, or there's kind of an user-friendly, if you want to look up your particular school district or school districts like it. And actually, there's a history of parcel tax elections and bond elections on ed-data. And so that's a really good source to kind of see who has parcel taxes, who doesn't. In terms of accountability, it's a local fund, so it's locally determined.
Following up on this gentleman's question, did you notice any difference between elementary school districts and high school districts or unified school districts?
Yes, so they tend to be elementary school districts, but there are more elementary school districts in the state. So I think if you take the share of districts by type, it's about 10% of each type of school district. It's just there are more elementary school districts, so they make up the majority. Yeah, you don't really see differences.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, do you have any sense as to a typical parcel tax? Is it in like the $100 to $200 range, or do you have any sort of distribution of what they look like?
Yeah, I think again, like we started collecting numbers on amounts and then just discovered there were too many holes. But from what I recall in that collection effort, it was probably 100 to 200. That's right. And again, it's going to depend on, in part, on where in the state you're talking about, because Piedmont needs to collect more money to pay teacher salaries than some places that would be more rural that would be trying, for instance.
And one more question. Have you seen any that were indexed for inflation?
Oh, yeah. That's very common. And again, we were flagging those to the extent that it was described. And saying, oh, wouldn't it be cool to look at, what's going on with these indexed measures versus others, but it's just the holes in the data and the complexity of figuring out what the impact really is made us back off.
So just a couple of comments. I've worked in school districts where we've passed bonds and parcel taxes, and the difference between a parcel tax election and a bond election, a school bond election, is night and day. It's like the PTA goes out and does the fundraising for the parcel tax, and the construction industry funds, not to get too far into it, the campaign for school bonds. And so one of the tactics that was used by a district that I worked in was to place the bond and a parcel tax on the ballot at the same time. And then the entire machine, if you will, was working towards the goal of providing additional revenue for the school district. So that's interesting. And the other thing, I think, one of the things you noted in your thing about the bonds was that the average amount increased. And so maybe when with the 55% threshold, maybe the same could be said for the prospects with parcel taxes, because I'll tell you, the parcel taxes in many cases are just crazy low. I mean, and they're crazy low because everybody goes through the process, as you said, of doing the surveys, figuring out what you can get, and not related at all to what your need is, and then backing into what you can get. Anyway.
Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you guys very much, and again, please fill out your surveys and leave them at the table on your way out.